Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be sprinkling a little knowledge on something I think most of us probably have in our pantries right now, and that is salt. But did you know that your salt might also contain, well, a dash of heavy metals?
It's true. We're going beyond a pinch of salt today and looking at a recent investigation by Mamavation, and they tested 23 common salt brands, and the results are, well, pretty surprising.
Yeah, Mamavation is a consumer advocacy group. They focus on healthy living, and they sent these salts off to an EPA-certified lab to check for things like, aluminum and lead and even microplastics.
And what's fascinating here is they found that every single salt had at least some detectable levels of heavy metals.
Wow, that's a bit unsettling. But before we all panic and toss out our salt shakers, it is important to note that none of the levels they found were high enough to trigger what's called a Prop 65 warning. Now, that's a California law that requires businesses to warn people about significant exposure to certain chemicals, and that includes some heavy metals.
Right, so while the levels weren't extremely high, it still raises questions about where these heavy metals are coming from and what the long-term effects of, consuming them might be.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's dig into some of those findings a bit. Aluminum was pretty common. It showed up in 78% of the salts tested, and over a third of those had levels exceeding 100,000 parts per billion, or ppb for short.
Yeah, and you might be wondering, like, how does aluminum even get into salt in the first place? Sometimes it's naturally occurring, but in some cases it's actually added. Certain aluminum compounds are used as anti-caking agents to keep the salt from, like, clumping together.
Huh, interesting. So it's not always about, like environmental contamination or something. Sometimes it's an intentional additive. What about arsenic? Momavation found that in all the salts.
Yeah. Well, arsenic is naturally found in, soil and water, and that explains why it's present in so many foods. But its presence can also be linked to historical use of arsenic-based pesticides. And these chemicals can linger in the environment for years, potentially contaminating crops and water sources that are used in food production.
Wow. It really makes you think twice about where your food comes from. Huh?
Uh-uh.
Okay, Momavation also found cadmium in 70% of the salts they tested.
Right, and here's where the source of the salt becomes particularly interesting. So Himalayan salt, which is known for its pink hue and it's, often touted for its mineral content, Himalayan salt often showed higher levels of cadmium, and this could be due to the soil conditions in regions where it's mined, like Pakistan.
So even something marketed as natural isn't necessarily free from these contaminants.
Right.
What about lead? I feel like lead is like a particularly scary one.
Yeah, it is. And lead was found in a whopping 96% of the salts. And this is where, understanding historical context is important. Think about, things like leaded gasoline. Those past uses of lead can still impact our environment and potentially contaminate the food supply.
Yeah, it's amazing how these legacy issues can kind of come back and affect us today. Well, at least there's some good news in all of this. Mercury was not detected in any of the salts tested.
Mm.
So we've talked about the what. Now let's dive into the how. How do these heavy metals actually end up in our salt?
Well, there are a few key pathways. We've already touched on, natural occurrence and lingering pesticide residues. But, manufacturing processes themselves can also introduce heavy metals, either through, contaminated equipment or additives used during processing.
Right, so it's not just about the source of the salt itself, but also how it's handled and processed along the way.
Precisely. And we can't forget about storage and transportation. If salt is stored in improper conditions, like outdoors in areas with contaminated soil, it can absorb heavy metals from the environment.
Gotcha, so there are multiple points along the way where this contamination could be happening.
Exactly. And then there's also air pollution, right? Heavy metals can travel through the air and settle onto crops or into water sources, and eventually they make their way into the food we eat. And yes, that includes salt.
It kind of paints a pretty sobering picture of how widespread these heavy metals can be.
Hmm.
Kind of makes you wonder if we should just avoid salt altogether, but I guess that's not really practical, is it?
No, not really. And it's important to remember that none of these salts exceeded levels that would require a Prop 65 warning. But however, even small amounts of heavy metals can accumulate in our bodies over time, which brings us to the crucial question of health implications.
Right, because even if a single serving of salt isn't going to, cause immediate harm, what happens when we consume these heavy metals, day after day, year after year?
That's where things get a little more complicated. And that's exactly what we'll unpack in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore what these heavy metals can do to our bottles and what you need to know to make informed choices about your salt consumption. Welcome back. Let's shift our focus now to, as promised, those health implications we mentioned. So we've established that heavy metals are present in salt, but like what does that really mean for our bodies?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Like, we know that none of these salts triggered a Prop 65 warning, meaning they didn't exceed California's, stricter limits for certain chemicals. But is there even such a thing as a truly safe level when it comes to heavy metals?
Well, that's a really complex issue.
Meh.
You see, for some heavy metals, like lead, for example, there's no established safe level of exposure. Even tiny amounts, especially over a long period, can build up in the body.
So it's not just about, like, avoiding a huge dose all at once. It's about understanding this cumulative effect.
Exactly. And the health problems these heavy metals can cause, they're not, just minor inconveniences. Some, like lead and mercury, are what we call neurotoxins.
Neurotoxins meaning they can actually damage our brains and nervous systems. That's scary stuff.
It is. And then you've got heavy metals like cadmium and arsenic, which have been linked to various types of cancer.
So we're not just talking about, like, feeling a bit sluggish after a salty meal. This is serious long-term stuff.
Precisely. And it's why, being aware of our total exposure to heavy metals, not just from salt, but from all sources, is so crucial.
Right, like those warnings about, certain fish being high in mercury.
Exactly. It all adds up. So minimizing our overall, what we call toxic load, is key.
Okay, so knowing all this, what are some, like, practical steps we can take to minimize heavy metals?
Right.
Specifically from salt.
Well, awareness is the first step. And you're already ahead of the game just by listening to this deep dive. But Momovation's investigation, which we'll link to in the show notes, is a fantastic resource. They categorize the salts they tested into like best, better, and not our favorite based on their findings.
So consumers can use that as a starting point when they're choosing their salt.
Absolutely. Opt for brands that have, undergone independent testing and show lower overall levels.
And maybe just, generally cutting back on salt overall.
That's always a smart move for heart health, regardless of heavy metals. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, but let's be honest, most of us are getting way more than that.
And a lot of that excess sodium is coming from, processed foods, things that already have salt added.
Exactly. So cooking more at home, using fresh ingredients gives you more control over your salt intake and potentially reduces your heavy metal exposure from those processed foods.
So it's not just a salt swap, it's a broader, like, dietary shift.
Yeah, it's about connecting those dots between, what we eat and our overall well-being.
Now let's talk about some of Momovation's specific findings. So they had, like, a best list, a better list, and a not our favorite list.
Right, and what's important to note here is that even those top-rated salts still had some detectable levels of heavy metals. It's about choosing the options with the lowest contamination, not necessarily expecting zero across the board.
Got it. So on the best list, Morton iodized salt stood out for having consistently low heavy metal levels across the board.
Which might surprise some people who, think of iodized salt as being like overly processed or something. But on the flip side, Jacobsen salt, which is a popular sea salt brand, also performed well.
But even Jacobsen had some detectable aluminum.
Which highlights a really crucial point. There's no one-size-fits-all answer here. Some people may be more sensitive to certain heavy metals than others. It's about, personal needs and preferences.
Okay. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we had Celtic sea salt, which had the highest lead levels in the study.
And Himalayan salt had notably high aluminum levels. And then there's Redmond's Real Salt, a popular natural salt brand, which also showed high lead levels.
Which is interesting because Redmond's is often marketed as a pure and natural option. This really shows that even those types of salts aren't immune to this contamination.
Absolutely. And, this brings us to some of the reader comments on Momovation's article. They highlight some really important nuances in this conversation about salt. For example, one reader expressed concern about Morton iodized salt topping the list because it's a refined salt, meaning it undergoes processing that strips away many of the naturally occurring minerals.
So it's almost like a trade-off.
Yeah.
Lower heavy metals, but potentially fewer beneficial minerals.
Exactly. And that's where, individual choice comes in. What are your priorities when it comes to salt? Are you more concerned about heavy metals, or are those minerals more important to you? There's no right or wrong answer.
Another reader commented on Redmond Real Salt, acknowledging its popularity, but also raising concerns about those high lead levels.
And this is where, independent testing is so important. We can't just rely on marketing claims. We need that third-party verification to really know what's in our food.
And there was also a comment specifically about the aluminum found in Jacobsen salt.
Again, this emphasizes the need to consider individual sensitivities. Someone who's particularly concerned about aluminum, for example, might choose a different salt brand, even one lower down on the best list, if it means avoiding that specific metal.
And some readers questioned, like, why any refined salt was included on the best list at all, arguing that unrefined salts are inherently healthier because of their mineral content.
And that's a valid point. It really comes down to balancing those potential benefits with the potential
It
risks.
seems like there's a lot to consider when choosing salt.
There is. And it's not just about reading labels, it's about understanding where your salt comes from, how it's processed, and, what your individual health priorities are.
So what can listeners do if they're feeling a little overwhelmed by all this information? Where do they even begin?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll tackle as we wrap up this deep dive. We'll explore some actionable steps you can take to make informed choices about your salt intake, minimize your exposure to heavy metals, and advocate for a healthier food system. Stay with us.
Okay, we're back. And I gotta say, all this talk about heavy metals has made me look at my salt shaker a little differently.
Yeah, it really is kind of eye-opening, isn't it? This whole deep dive into salt has really highlighted how important it is to be, informed consumers. We can't just assume that something as basic as salt is, like, pure and harmless.
Exactly. But now that we are aware of this issue, what can we actually do about it? Where do we go from here?
Well, first of all, don't panic. We're not saying you need to toss out all your salt and swear it off forever. Instead, just use this knowledge to make more mindful choices.
Okay, so like practical steps. What are some things listeners can start doing, today to minimize their heavy metal intake from salt?
Well, a great starting point is, like we mentioned, Mamavation's investigation. We'll link to it in the show notes so you can check out their full rankings and everything. But definitely prioritize those best list salts when you're, out shopping.
And what if someone's like a real Himalayan salt devotee? What are their options?
Well, they might consider switching to a sea salt brand that fared well in the testing, like Jacobsen or Malden, for example.
Okay. And even within those best brands, there can be variation,
Well,
right?
yeah.
So it's about looking at the labels carefully.
Absolutely. Choose the specific product with the lowest overall heavy metal content.
Now, some people might be thinking, okay, but what about taste? Does switching salts mean sacrificing flavor?
Not at all. There's so many delicious salts out there. Experiment a little. You might even discover a new favorite.
And what about those salts that are marketed as having lots of trace minerals and stuff? Are those good options? Or are they more likely to be higher in the heavy metals too?
Well, it's kind of, it's a bit of a balancing act. They can be a great source of those minerals, but as we saw with, some of the Himalayan and Celtic sea salts, they can also have those higher levels of heavy metals. So it's about weighing those potential benefits and risks and making the choice that feels right for you.
It sounds like doing a little research is key.
It really is. And, don't be afraid to reach out to salt manufacturers directly. Ask them about their testing processes, where they source their salt, what steps they're taking to minimize heavy metal contamination.
Yeah, as consumers, we have the power to demand transparency and hold these companies accountable.
Exactly. We vote with our dollars, and by supporting companies that, prioritize purity and sustainability, we can actually drive some positive change in the food industry.
This whole deep dive has really emphasized that connection between our individual choices and the larger food system.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not just, passive consumers. We have agency, and we can actually make a difference.
So as we wrap up this salty exploration, what's the one key message you want listeners to take away from all of this?
If I had to distill it down to one thing, be curious. Don't be afraid to ask questions about your food, even something as, seemingly simple as salt. Knowledge is empowering, and understanding where our food comes from and what's in it allows us to make informed choices that support our health and well-being.
So well said. This whole conversation about salt has been a great reminder that there's always more to learn, and that every choice we make, even something as small as, choosing a salt brand, can actually have a ripple effect.
And those ripples can create some real waves of change.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this salty deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic, ready to unpack and explore together. Until then, stay curious and keep sprinkling that knowledge.